you for joining us this morning for this week's Come Follow Me lesson with the Mormon News Report podcast. My name is Jenny Noonan Dye, and I am joining you from Provo, Utah, along with my husband, John Dye. He is the one who's responsible for all that you're seeing on your screen, for those of you partaking of the video. As always, for those who are participating here in real time on our video stream, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you? What stood out to you in your study this week, whether it's the first time or the 50th time you've read these verses, or if you didn't read them at all. We get to as many comments as we can, just as we would if we were gathered all together in person. We like to try to use this space and time as a supplement to your other Come Follow Me studies, to sometimes take a deeper dive into at least one aspect of the lesson that stands out. We love having your participation and your feedback. I'd like to excuse my co-host for the Mormon News Report podcast, Brent Malone, in Detroit, as he tends to family responsibilities, and welcome our Come Follow Me leader. He's everything when it comes to these lessons. It's Ben Bernards in California. Good morning, Ben.
Good morning, Jenny. Good morning, John. Good morning, Judy from Ephraim and Randall from Heber, Utah. We are so glad that you're here. Welcome back to another Mormon News Report Hour of Power. Chapter of AP Doctrine and Covenants, adding to your Come Follow Me Sunday School. We're kind of the extra point after a touchdown.
I'm sure that is a reference to something. I don't know
sports ball.
I don't know what it is because I was asleep. However, congratulations to everybody who likes that.
If you're a fan of, I think as they call it in England, soccer, then and if you lived anywhere in Utah County, you probably didn't get much sleep last night. Rip, please bless all the folks at the soda shops and ice cream parlors last night. Good job, Cougars. If you like football, that was a good time.
Yeah.
So now for something completely different.
Yes.
Totally different topic today.
If I can just do a little ward business here. Yes, there and being in Provo, I will say I was awake at the beginning of the game and did hear the intensely loud, scary, to be frank, flyover. And I was like, that's got to be for the game. Please bless that's for the game. And so I guess there were fireworks afterwards. Didn't hear that. I was, like I said, out. Quickly, for those who are also friends of the Mormon News Report podcast, thank you for your patience. Brant and I did record an episode this past week, and just to kind of let you all know what is going on. So, please feel free to check that out on your streaming service of choice to just get an update there as far as what's going on. And thank you for your patience as we work through some stuff there. So yes, like you said, Ben, and now for something completely different.
Yeah,
we've got the lesson today. Today is September 12th, 2021, by the way. And the lesson is called Be Still and Know That I Am God. It covers Doctrine and Covenants, sections 98 through 101.
So anytime we talk about the struggles in Missouri, and yes, real quick, Judy, you say, yes, my tie. So quick shout out. This tie actually belonged to my grandfather, and he passed away. I'll have to check the calendar. I want to say 9 years ago. I think the last time that my grandfather wore this tie was when BYU beat Utah. And at his funeral, he has a lot of grandkids, and they invited all of his grandkids to come up, and they had a huge, like an old suitcase full of all of his ties. And they invited each grandkid to come up and pick a tie from grandpa that they got to wear. And this has stayed in my closet for nearly a decade, unworn, as it's just been kind of a little memorial to him. And today, it seemed appropriate. So glad to have that here.
Yes.
So come follow me for September 12th. Missouri. It's a challenging place. It was a challenging place, a challenging topic to discuss. And part of it is because sometimes the way that we address what happened in Missouri and what we learned from it is very distant. It's something that happened back then. It's something that happened to somebody else. It's something that, it's a chapter of our past that that seems kind of very foreign to us. And sometimes, frankly, we kind of run the risk of addressing it too highly. Like, we can say, yes, I can say there was a struggle in Missouri, and without really understanding more of the details there. And I think that can be kind of a problem because it feels like it doesn't really treat the lesson or that aspect of history with the gravity and the respect that it deserves. And B, it prevents us from learning lessons from the mistakes and saying, okay, well, what did they do wrong? What went wrong? And how can we not repeat that? And is that not one of the points of us studying history, right? So if this is a church history class, then let's get into the history of the church in this class. Real quickly, Joy, also you're saying, is there a way to watch this later after state conference? Yes, this stream is available on Facebook. You find our Facebook page, Mormon News Report, and that stream will be there. So if you don't want to watch it or you can't watch it right now, then yep, go ahead and find it. It'll always be available to watch later on. So let's talk a little bit about what happened back then, and then we'd like to kind of zoom out and take a look at the lessons learned and see why do hard things happen and how do we learn from them, and hopefully some better ideas on how we can best address a brighter future. That sound good? Sound like a plan?
Yes, let's.
Okay, so we're actually going to start off, rather than giving a summary of the history, I found that there is no better place than to go right to the source. Now, getting to the source is kind of hard because there is no one perfect canonical history book. And this is something we have to realize and admit, that because none of us were there and nobody sat down and wrote a transcript of what was happening at the time, any history that we study of the past is going to be a recreation and a facsimile from one perspective. Now, for today, we're going to read actually straight from Saints chapter 16. So this is the old classic, the big Saints book that was published. This has been vetted by historians. I found it to be wonderfully balanced and quite full. And I think there's nothing better than to actually look at part of the original text. So get cozy, get comfy. Uncle Ben's going to read you a little bit of a story. Maybe Jen, you and I can take we've got just a couple pages here to read. And if we want to go back and forth and each take a turn reading some of this stuff. But I think there's probably no better way than to actually hear in these own words an introduction of what happened. That sound good?
Perfect.
Okay, this is coming from Saints chapter 16, titled Only a Prelude. While the plans for Zion and the temple traveled by mail to Missouri, 9-year-old Emily Partridge leapt from her bed and rushed outside in her nightclothes. In the yard behind her house, not far from the temple site in Independence, she saw one of her family's large haystacks engulfed in flames. The fire reached high into the night sky, its bright yellow light casting long shadows behind those who stood by, helplessly watching the blaze. Accidental fires were common on the frontier, but this one was no accident. Small mobs had been vandalizing the Saints' property all through the summer of 1833, hoping to scare the newcomers away from Jackson County. No one had been hurt so far, but the mob seemed to grow more aggressive with every attack. Emily did not understand all the reasons why people in Jackson County wanted the Saints to leave. She knew her family and friends were unlike their neighbors in many ways. The Missourians she overheard in the streets had a different way of speaking, and the women wore a different style of dress. Some of them walked around barefoot in the summer and washed their clothes with large paddles instead of the washboards Emily was used to in Ohio. And we'll go on to the next page. And would you pick this one up, Jen?
Sure. These were trivial differences, but there were also major disagreements Emily knew little about. People in Independence did not like that the Saints preached to Indians and disapproved of slavery. In the northern states, where most church members had lived, owning slaves was against the law. But in Missouri, enslaving Black people was legal, and the longtime settlers staunchly defended it. Excuse me. The fact that the Saints usually kept to themselves did not help ease suspicions. As more of them arrived in Zion, they worked together to build and furnish homes, cultivate farms, and raise children. They were eager to lay the foundation of a holy city that would endure through the millennium. The Partridges' own house, situated in the middle of Independence, was a step toward making the town into Zion. It was a simple two-story house, lacking the refinement of Emily's old home in Ohio, but it signaled that the Saints were in Independence to stay. As the blazing haystack showed, it also made them a target.
Okay. In the final section, we're actually going to skip ahead just a little bit in the book, but here's an interesting excerpt. With mobs already harassing the Saints in Independence and nearby settlements, it was not hard for Samuel. This was one of the other leaders who was working against the Saints. It was not hard for Samuel to find others who agreed with him. For more than a year, town leaders had been rallying their neighbors against the Saints. Some had distributed handbills and called town meetings, urging people to drive the newcomers out of the area. Initially, most of the locals thought the Saints were harmless fanatics who pretended to receive revelations, heal by the laying on of hands, and perform other miracles. But as more and more church members settled in the county, claiming that God had given them independence as a promised land, Samuel and other town leaders saw them and their revelations as threats to their property and their political power. And now William's letter stoked one of their greatest fears. So, side note, the letter that he's talking about was a note that had been published in the Millennial Star, which was a church publication, like a newsletter, roughly equivalent to what we would think of, say, a Facebook status post by the church newsroom or newsroom update. It was the common way that people would get updates and news on what was going. And one of the things that one of the leaders had published in the church was lines that could be interpreted as abolitionist and anti-slavery. Now, it didn't flat out call for it. They didn't say it very succinctly, but if you were pro-slavery and you saw this in the newspaper, it looked like they were going to move into your town and they were going to get rid of that. So William's letter stoked one of their greatest fears. Just 2 years before, dozens of enslaved people in another state had rebelled and killed more than 50 white men and women in less than 2 days. Slave owners in Missouri and across the southern states dreaded something similar happening in their communities. Some feared that if the Saints invited free blacks to Jackson County, their presence could cause slaves to yearn for freedom and rebel. Okay, so part of what we see framed here is that we've got this little kind of political difference between the Saints and the folks in Missouri. A lot of it is certainly based around slavery. Now, something that was hinted to in the previous slide, in the previous section, was talking about how the Saints were gathering together and everybody's working together. Really what this means was the Saints would stick to themselves. They had this tendency of doing business with people that they knew, people that they were comfortable with, which meant that if there were multiple shops opening up in town, the Latter-day Saints would usually shop exclusively at only the Latter-day Saints store and not the general public Missouri store. Now, if you're already kind of tense about who your neighbors are, if you see this group of a different community coming in, and a lot of them were first generation, or all of them were first generation Latter-day Saint converts. Many of them were poor people that had come over and emigrated from England and from Europe. So you have this division that is popping up. You have this distrust that is popping up. You have comments spreading through town where the Mormons are only going to do business with the Mormons. They're only going to let their kids play with other Mormons. They're only going to go to church with other Mormons. They're only going to stick together. And now they're coming in and they're going to start taking over the community. It's easy to see how the seeds of division and rancor get planted. So I think one of the key takeaways from this is that we do not do history justice if we only focus on our victimhood in this situation. Mm-hmm. We were not completely innocent in the beginnings of this. And later on in the book of Saints, as it talks about the history, you'll then see that we have little sparks of violence that started to appear, like the burning haystack, and you've got, threats that started to pop up. There are a few recorded instances where words turned into shoving, turned into hitting, turned into threats of more violence, turned into brawls. One person starts hitting another. That person goes home and gets their buddies and their family, and they come back. And then it starts escalating, almost to the point where we don't really know who started it, but we do know that we continued it. that we then said, hey, if they're going to get guns, I'm going to get guns as well. And we would fight back. And we would sometimes go and press the attack to others, which of course is only going to make that rise up even more. So this is a challenge. Before I go any further, Jen, anything stand out to you from the lesson, from those segments that we've read so far, from that little bit of history?
Well, as you're discussing this, I kind of think, I think that, like you always say, Ben, it's important to try our very best to view the history from the lens of their present time rather than ours. While there may be some similarities, excuse me, of what we experience today, we don't have the same perspective or experience, and I would say even understanding, to really grasp what was happening at that time then. Because, when we talk about things like people moving into neighborhoods with differing political views or whatever the case is, that is not the same as what we're reading about, which is a group of people coming into a newly settled land and settling up their own, establishing their own settlement as a group. That doesn't happen nowadays. And, we can talk about assimilation versus, being true to native cultures and all that all day. But it really is important to remember that, or to try to do our best to understand where they were coming from, because this isn't something that we experience today.
Absolutely. Now, with all of this, the details and the rest of the troubles that happened in Missouri, we won't review all of them here, but suffice it to say that it was one of the darkest chapters and periods of our Mormon history. And a lot of that is from our own causing. And so now we start to zoom out just a tiny little bit and kind of reflect on how did we get there and what can we learn from it? John, if you pull up the next slide, please. When we talk about struggles and trials, it's easy to ask the question, why do bad things happen to me? And we've talked about this before on this podcast. And as I was working on these notes, I realized I really wanted to be careful on how we talked about it. And so I said, this particular question that we're asking in the slide we're looking at, I went back and I changed the language a couple of times because I realized the question is not why do bad things happen? Instead, it's probably more like, why do hard things happen? Because if we call the hard things bad things, then we're instantly making a snap judgment saying that something about the entire situation is bad, or that everything is bad, or that perhaps we are bad, or that the other person is bad, or that the thing itself that happened was a bad thing. And I think if we do that, then we get in the way of ourselves and we block our own opportunity to learn. It's not that the event itself was good or bad. The event was simply the event. If we were to qualify it, I would say, let's look at, was it hard or easy? Was it constructive or destructive? Was it insightful and teaching, or was it benign and eventless? So in this case, perhaps it's more about, why do hard things happen to us? And one thing that I found wonderfully useful in the Come Follow Me lesson, whichever a sweet member of the church writing committee put together some thoughts at the beginning, they took a different tack when they were writing some comments in that lesson manual, because they did not use a trope that I've heard so many times in so many other lessons that say, well, bad things happen because God did X, Y, Z, or bad things happen because God says this. And this is something that I think we have struggled with. I know that I've struggled with it in the past, which is ascribing the divine hand to so many of the events in our lives that have no explanation. And there can be comforting subconscious reasons why we do that. But what was interesting in this manual was they said, frequently when hard or bad things happen to us, it happens because of the results of our choices, our agency, someone else's choices, or sometimes through no one's choice at all. In other words, it was complete random circumstance, or it was the laws of nature, or nobody in particular was to blame. Sometimes you roll a natural one, sometimes you've got that critical fail, and it's nobody's fault. Now, in the context of this class, we are clearly talking about the combination of our choices and others' choices. And this is where we see the proverbial tipping of the dominoes. Like we said, when we're dealing with the past, we can't go back and find out what was the one first thing that tipped that very first domino to lead to the eventual expulsion from Missouri. But we did have a hand in placing the dominoes in a certain order, to continue the analogy. We did set up ourselves in such a way that that it became problematic, and that we caused problems, and we contributed to these problems later on. Now, I found this lovely quote that's attributed to Elder D. Todd Christofferson. Excuse me. I was not able to find the original source and the citation for this. Jenny, would you mind reading this for me?
Happy to. Problems will come into all of our lives. It's part of just being here upon this earth. And some people think that religion or having faith in God will protect you from bad things. I don't think that's the point. I think the point is that if our faith is strong, that when bad things happen, which they will, we'll be able to deal with them.
Okay. I think this is not only a lovely sentiment, just as a general idea, but I think this is a very constructive way to use or a constructive way to use our theology of how agency and cause and effect work. And what's different about this is the Judeo-Christian tradition from whence Mormonism came, especially the ancient Jewish tradition, was that God's hand was the one rolling the dice and frequently tipping the dominoes. Part of the entire lesson of the Old Testament was that hard times came upon the house of Israel as a direct result of the choices they made, and by a vengeful God that was meting out wrath because of the choices that they made. He was bringing that to them because of things that they did wrong. And so when they say, why do bad things happen to us? They would frequently say, well, because God wanted it to be so. This is our fault. God is doing this. He is punishing us. And I think what we're seeing more nowadays is a change of, or at least in our theology, we're hoping to see a change in that perspective. That when bad things happen to us, it's not always because God is punishing us. When bad things happen to us, it's not necessarily because God is even involved at all. In fact, if we were to understand a world where God gives complete agency and complete freedom of choice and autonomy to his sons and daughters, then he's going to let those daughters and sons use that agency. And that means that sometimes they're going to tip over each other's dominoes. And so in this case, I love what Elder Christofferson is saying, that some people think religion or having faith in God will protect you from bad things. And that is simply not the case. I have a child that is preparing to serve a mission and is currently away at college right now. And there's nothing more that my father heart wants than to protect them from the hard things. And there's a part of me that is very scared about them going out into the world on a mission. And I realized that no amount of faith can shield them from those hard things, because it's not supposed to. The goal is not to have a shield and a force field and a bubble that exempts us from the difficulties, but hopefully to give us a perspective and a purpose. So when we go through those hard things, we come out the better for it. Jen, does that make sense?
Yes. Yes, it does.
So what do you think about what Elder Christofferson is saying here, or the things that we've talked about before we go any further? Any ideas?
Well, yeah, I mean, I really like this pull from Elder Christofferson, because it's accurate. It's basically, kind of a complete pushback on prosperity gospel, right? That there is no such thing as we are so righteous that we can escape the trials of life. Trials are part of life. And, Ben, you mentioned that that we try to ascribe, reasoning. And I think that's human nature, because it is difficult for us to accept the idea that some things just are, that it isn't the result of our choice or someone else's choice. It is the result. It was no one's choice. And I don't want to veer off too much here, but that was a lesson I learned early in my adult life. My second child is a son, and his name is Taylor, and he was stillborn, and that was almost 21 years ago when that happened, and it was something that medically, the doctor, one of the most helpful things that my doctor told me is that this isn't something that you could have caused, and it isn't something that you could have prevented. Because when tragedy strikes, we all search for why. And, we can drive ourselves crazy with trying to, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing to, in our minds, go back in time to see what could have prevented the tragedy, as long as we understand that what we're doing is trying to better the circumstances moving forward. It's one of the things that can be used for good or evil. And so sometimes, often it's a really good idea to get used to the fact, or the idea that there's no answer. The answer is sometimes, I don't know, and there is no answer. So I really like what Elder Christofferson says, because it's about, okay, there's no reason. So what are you going to do about it? This tragedy happened not because of your lack of faith or someone else's actions against you. It just happened. And so I love that, this idea that if our faith is strong, when the bad things do happen, we can deal with them.
Absolutely. I think it's part of our caveman evolutionary brain where when bad things go wrong, we, like you say, we try to find out the why behind it so we can prevent it from happening again. That's our problem solving nature, right? If my little caveman baby got sick and I go back to try to figure out what made them sick, and I learned, oh, well, maybe the meat, the only thing that was different was they ate this one piece of food. Okay, well, don't eat that food going forward, and then we'll survive, right? That's our survival instinct. So when we face a scenario where we cannot trace back the cause, if we're standing here at a timeline and I can't go into the past and I can't find a cause, that can be terrifying for us, because then there's a problem that has no solution, and there's challenges that have no preventability. Yeah. And I think what we're now seeing is the next evolution is, instead of going back to the past to try to find what caused it, what we have to do is look forward in the other direction towards the future and say, how do we go through this? Like you say, when that tragedy strikes, and if there's nothing that we could have done, how can we come out from the better from it? Or now, what are we going to do differently because of it?
Yep.
One of the things, like Eileen said, I remember years ago hearing somebody say to a friend who had a tragic event, it makes you wonder what you could have done, that God is punishing you like this. And that is completely the wrong approach to take, because things like this, they're not God's punishments, right? It's life. And I know that it's not comforting to simply dismiss it as that's life, but that's part of the truth. Now, be that as it may, let's go back and let's wrap up a couple things here about Missouri, because I think there are some very key, tough lessons that are helpful for us to embrace about what we did wrong. So some very specific things that our Latter-day Saint heritage, I think, should really own up to. The first thing, words matter. The power of the press today is very, very well known. Everybody knows that we can use official and unofficial news and various communication sites to spread good words around. And at the same time, people can and will misunderstand, I'm going to say, everything that they say. I mean, nowadays, especially with the ease of communication, the sheer simplicity of getting messages out there simply magnifies and multiplies the probability that somebody is going to misunderstand what I say. So if I know that that's the case, and if I know that my message, no matter what I say, is always going to be read, it's going to be heard, it's going to be retweeted, reposted, upvoted, shared via a silly Vine, or as the TikToks are going, it means that to a certain degree, there's not as much privacy and there's also not as much nuance. And the probability of somebody misunderstanding or missing the nonverbal cues or missing the tone of my voice or anything like that, it means that those words, there's a higher probability than ever before, are going to be taken out of context, are going to be misinterpreted, are going to be misunderstood, or I'm going to be saying, wait a minute, that's not what I meant. Which means that if anything, we need to be even more careful that our words should be Christ-like at all times, and knowing that things are going to get out to the public. Because like tipping of the dominoes, whatever we say can have a huge significance. We cannot control what people, how they will interpret them. We can't control how they're going to misunderstand them. And we do not have the luxury of folding our arms and sitting back and saying, well, it looks like you misunderstood my words, so that's on you. No, it's on us. The words that we say absolutely matter. And the second tough lesson that I take from this is connected to that. As we said when we were kids, when you're playing tag or you're giving a gift to somebody, there's no take backs. You can't take it back. In other words, retracting the phrase afterward doesn't make it so that it has never been said in the first place, right? Once you say it, once you post it, once you, like we teach our kids with internet safety, once you post something on the internet, it is there forever. You cannot delete it. It is guaranteed to stay out there. The cat's out of the bag. When I was little, I would get in fights with my siblings, and sometimes I may have been a little bit too energetic. Maybe I smacked my sister a little too many times, and she would start crying, and she'd go running off to mom. And what do siblings do when they smack another one and they start crying? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Don't tell mom. I'm sorry. And then the mom comes and he starts yelling at you, and you get in trouble. And I would look at her indignantly, and I would be like, I said I was sorry. What is she crying for? But the thing is that you can't take back the hit once it's been hit. You cannot unfeel the pain. You cannot remove the damage that has been done. And once those words go out, and if those words have cut like a knife or have inflamed like a torch, we can't magically undo it. Once that wound has been sliced open, you can't say, okay, it's no longer there. Now we have the difficulty of stitching closed and of dousing and of extinguishing, because we cannot go back into the past. And this, I think, brings to the third. Sorry, go ahead.
Can I add to that? Just that you're absolutely right. I just want to make sure that we also add that, like you said, like the work of stitching up the wound or of extinguishing the fire and everything, because I just want to make sure that it doesn't come off like we are encouraging cancel culture or something, because,
sure,
you know, because we absolutely believe in the atonement. But like you said, I just like saying sorry doesn't mean that what happened didn't happen. So, right. You know what I mean? I just want to make sure that that's crystal clear.
Absolutely. So good. I think one of the third tough lessons that we need to own up for is I would simply say it as muskets beget muskets. Mm-hmm. And that violence, whether it's actual physical violence or real metaphorical symbolic calls for violence, even if we think that we're trying to defend, and if it's used for symbolic impact, the fact is that violence is about destruction. Violence destroys. In Missouri, we fought and we attacked. And someone on the other side fought and they attacked. And we don't know who pulled the first trigger, and we don't know who shot that first bullet or who first lit the torch exactly. And maybe in the grand scheme, maybe it doesn't even really matter, because from a certain perspective, there were violent groups on both sides. Yes, there were parties inside Mormonism that called for even greater violence against their Missouri neighbors. There's a group called, they called themselves after the tribe of Dan of Israel, which took pride in being the muscle, the enforcer. Some would call them the ultra-conservative violent arm of the House of Israel. And they called themselves the Danites, and they prided themselves on saying, we will stand up and we will do the dirty work and we will defend. And they heralded themselves as being strong and brave and true and willing to wield the sword of justice as they righteously slayed their enemies. And they called for responding with great strength. And when the community hears about that, what's their natural response? Well, they're going to respond with even more strength and even more violence. And when we see the same thing today, if our worldview is that we should respond to violence with more violence, it will only make it worse. Mm-hmm. I believe that part of the message of Christianity is, and I wish there was a better word for this, a certain degree, part of the message of Christianity is a certain degree of pacifism. Mm-hmm. And that's not pacifism as in the I'm going to sit back and do nothing, but it's the Christ who did not respond when he was struck on the cheek. Right. It is the man who literally told his disciples to turn the other cheek. That is the message of Christianity, that yes, there will be people that are going to be absolutely angry with us. And sometimes the most Christ-like way that we can respond, if we are going to douse that anger, is to let our bodies and our minds be that calming water of life that puts out the fire. And if we respond to strength and violence, even metaphorical or symbolic, with only more on our side, it's only going to escalate. And sometimes we only make the problems worse. And the fourth one that goes with this, as I would say, isolationist exceptionalism fosters exceptional isolation. And here's what I mean by this. The problems that we had with Missouri, part of the problems was our folks went in telling other people, we are God's chosen people. This is God's chosen land for us. And so the message that was heard was, we're better than you. God picked us. We don't need you. This is our community. We're first. You're second. We're going to go it alone because we're stronger. God's on our side. We're on the inside. You're on the outside. We are the us. You are the them. We are the chosen. You're the not chosen. We're the right hand. And you can take it as far as you want. But the idea was they thought that they were exceptional and they thought that they didn't need anybody. As a result, when they cut themselves off from the community, they realized that they truly cut themselves off from the community, and they were then left alone. They had no support. They had no one to whom they could turn. They had no sympathetic ear. Because they thought that they could go into this without weaving themselves into the community, then once the stress of those fibers came, they had no fibers that could be stressed. So for us today, if we're going to be planted in a community, if we are going to be in the world, perhaps we can be of the world to a certain degree, that we need to be woven and rooted in, and segregating ourselves, whether it's by faith or color or nationality or football team or political party or any other identity, eventually will only doom us. So if we claim that we have God on our side, we don't need anybody else, then we might realize that we don't even have God on our side when push comes to shove.
Very good.
Jen, your thoughts?
I really like what you've shared, and this comment here from Judy saying, I've heard those comments today. My kid can't play with your kid because you aren't LDS. And I'll be honest with you. I don't understand. Like I've heard people that I know have said that they've heard that. And I feel lucky that I haven't experienced that for my own kids. But wow. I mean, wow. And going back to what you were talking about how you said you wish that there were a better word than being pacifist. I feel like to enter a battle and refuse to perpetuate violence is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of extreme strength, really.
Absolutely.
And so it's not the default always to do so, but it is what the Savior would do. So.
Amen. Absolutely. So there's an interesting verse that was left in the Doctrine and Covenants. It could have been cut out, it could have been edited, but it was left in there. And it's a rebuke to the saints where God calls them out and says, look, a lot of this was your own dang fault. Let's take a look in Doctrine and Covenants. This is going to go to section 101, verses 2 through 9. Jen, do you mind reading for us? They're small verses. It goes pretty quick.
Yeah, no problem. I, the Lord, have suffered the affliction to come upon them, wherewith they have been afflicted in consequence of their transgressions. Yet I will own them, and they shall be mine in that day when I shall come to make up my jewels. Therefore they must needs be chastened and tried, even as Abraham, who was commanded to offer up his only son. For all those who will not endure chastening, but deny me, cannot be sanctified. Behold, I say unto you, there were jarrings and contentions and envyings and strifes and lustful and covetous desires among them. Therefore, by these things they polluted their inheritances. They were slow to hearken unto the voice of the Lord their God. Therefore, the Lord their God is slow to hearken unto their prayers, to answer them in the day of their trouble. In the day of their peace they esteemed lightly my counsel, but in the day of their trouble, of necessity, they feel after me. Verily I say unto you, notwithstanding their sins, my bowels are filled with compassion towards them. I will not utterly cast them off, and in the day of wrath I will remember mercy.
Good stuff. Thank you. You know, everything we've been talking about at this point has been kind of like the external problems that we caused for ourselves, and they were more of a social political nature. And I'm very appreciative of verse 6 here that calls out the internal moral failings of the people as well. And this is something that we don't have a lot of record on, but if God is saying that there were jarrings, there were contentions, there was all these other sins that they had committed, he is then looking with his all-piercing gaze right into their hearts and saying, look, those feelings and those things that you were doing wrong on the inside started causing the other actions that you then see on the outside. So let's be perfectly clear, people, about who caused these problems. This is not me saying I'm going to punish you. This is you punishing yourselves. Mm-hmm. And that can be kind of the hard thing that we have to remember about ourselves. But I love how at the very end, how he ends on a hopeful high note. And that's where I'd like to kind of turn this final discussion here, is looking back and we say, okay, when these hard things happen, when these difficult challenges happen, how can we make the best of it? What lessons can we learn going forward, right? And are there general principles that we can follow of how to turn these things for our good? And linked in the Come Follow Me lesson, and as you'll see later in Doctrine and Covenants, in section 90, verse 24, there is a beautiful, simple little formula. And if I were sitting here with my seminary kids, I would have them marking this sucker up. This is section 90-24. And let's take a look at all the individual elements of this. Let's pick apart and dissect this verse just a little bit. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and read this one, if you don't mind, Jen. 90-24. Search diligently, pray always, be believing, and all things shall work together for your good, if ye walk uprightly and remember the covenant wherewith ye have covenanted one with another. Okay, now, first off, right off the bat, what is God not saying here? He is not saying that if you search diligently, pray always, and be believing, all things shall now be easy and you won't have hard times going forward. Right. Or you will never be punished, or you will never have any problems, right? He's not saying that. That's not what it says. But it's saying that all things will work together for your good. You know, we talked about the perspective of you can either look in the past and try to figure out why it happened, or you can look into the future and see how it's going to be different. And this verse and part of our key theology is looking forward. It's saying things will work together for your good. So first off, the elements that he recommends in this formula: search diligently, pray always, be believing. Jen, any ideas? How do those things help us or help things work together for our good?
Well, they're actions. They are, so often in life we want to be told what to do. We want direction. We want specifics. So this is a to-do list. This is exactly what we can do. Now, some people might be discouraged by this or say, that's not enough, or I need more specifics. But but I feel like it is both specific and vague enough, meaning vague, meaning it can apply in the ways that work for you and yours. To search diligently means something different for you than it does for me. That's
and pray always. And let's be clear, pray always does not mean that we are literally doing nothing but praying all the time. Right. So we have to qualify that. And also notice that, those first three things we've highlighted there are not the only elements in the equation, that there is another, right? It says, if ye walk uprightly, remember the covenant wherewith ye have covenanted one with another. It's also, if we're going to word nerd about this, I was looking into this and I thought, okay, this whole walk uprightly, is God talking about physical posture? Is he talking about like being, standing straight up? And so I pulled out a thesaurus and I found some things that I found to be very helpful. This seems to be an older English phrase, walking uprightly. An easy synonym for upright is upstanding. Now, this has nothing to do with physical posture and everything to do with moral posture. So an upstanding person, other synonyms for this are ethical, honest, moral, straightforward, trustworthy, good, incorruptible, principled, true, and upright. So if you are walking uprightly, or if you are an upstanding citizen, then those are the values by which you are going to be living your life. Now, before we go any further, take a look at all those different values. Jen, can you see how those things could have been helpful back in Missouri? How maybe that would have been a useful thing to have?
Absolutely.
And we're not saying that the people in Missouri, that our folks were dishonest, right? We're not saying that they were not trustworthy, but was everything they did 100% ethical? Was everything they did truly good? Was everything they did completely principled? Maybe it wasn't. And that is part of the thing that we need to remember about this. Mm-hmm. And the final thing that I love about this is, it says, if you walk uprightly, so you have all these morals, and then remember the covenant wherewith you have covenanted. And at first I was like, okay, you remember your temple covenants, blah, blah, blah. And then I realized, wait a minute, no. God is not saying, remember the covenant you've made with me. He's saying, remember the covenant you've made with each other. As in, this is the connection between other people. And this brings us to the final question. This is the summit and the point of the entire lesson. John, can you pull the next slide, please? So question for Jen and for everybody else. How does being an upstanding moral person help us through hard times? How does being an upstanding moral person help us through hard times? Not prevent hard times and not let us escape hard times, but how does it help us prevent or help us through hard times? What do you think? So
my thoughts are as follows. In this essay, I will, just kidding. I feel like if we are upstanding, what that comes down to is having personal integrity, right? And I mean that exactly as I said, personal integrity, not even necessarily integrity that is outward facing toward others, but within ourselves, because hard times often, they are experienced on a personal level. And I feel like having the integrity of knowing that you're on the right path can help you have, or help us have, the perspective that this is temporary, that just as in the past we have made it, like every person here, every person who is participating in this lesson or listening now or in the future has made it through every single hard time, every single one. And so I feel like when we are upstanding, when we have integrity, to me, it kind of rings close to the idea of being in the right frame of mind. Or, we've talked before about like the phrase, get out of your head, or, that sort of thing. But just having more of a wider perspective than just the tragedy or the darkness in front of us. So for me, it feels like when everything else in my personal life is aligned, then I can see the hard time for what it is, which is an experience that will work out for my good. And man, is it hard right now. But it isn't clouded by other complications, I guess, that might come from being untrustworthy, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. All these moral synonyms and this whole idea of whatever moral posture that we personally have, I see them as like guideposts that can inform our behavior. It helps us filter our choices. It helps direct whatever possible responses we might have to that hard time. So if we can't always choose what happens to us, we can always choose how we respond to it, right? Mm-hmm. And all these different moral values can be the boundaries within which we will choose our response. I love what Laurel said, this comment from the class. When you understand who you are, you also know that nothing that's only bad will happen to you, and you understand that you're loved, right? That comes with a perspective. Some final closing thoughts here about this is that in those verses that we read, God said that he would, in the day that he comes to make up his jewels. John, would you go to the next slide for me, please? You know, I think anybody that has worked with stones or jewels, or if you've ever had one of those cool rock tumbler things when you were a kid, you've probably seen that rocks and jewels, they never start out pretty, right? Like any gemstone that you have in a piece of jewelry, it never started like that. It came out ugly. It started dirty. It had lots of bits of dirt and rock and lots of other things in there. And sometimes you can only catch a tiny glimpse of the gem and the jewel that's on the inside. And sometimes you can't see any of it. But the master jeweler knows what's inside. And he knows that if you're going to work to polish it, you can't just go to the straight 6,000 grit polishing paste. You got to start with the 80 grit sandpaper, right? That stuff that is so coarse that it would take your skin off. And you need multiple successive levels. You can't. I do little hobby woodworking stuff on the side, and I've got this entire spectrum of different grades of sandpaper. Because if I've got a lovely piece of walnut and I'm making something that I think is going to be really neat and cool, and I want it to be polished and totally smooth like glass, I have to start as low as I can and gradually wean away with successive grits of paper all the way up. I have to go a tiny little bit at a time, because each level of grit has its own purpose. The cellulose fibers actually respond differently to every successive piece of grit. And if I skip any step along the way, it won't work. I'm going to miss something. So for us, that's kind of where we are. We started clear back in this premortal life, and we've spent decades here, and we are hoping to become that polished gem at the very end. And that's what this life is, right? This entire life is that polishing process. So to one degree or another, we are all going to be worn down. Like Joseph said, he is that rough stone rolling down from a high mountain. And the only polishing I get is when some corner gets rubbed off by coming in contact with something else, striking with accelerated force against religious bigotry or priestcraft or lawyercraft or doctorcraft or editors, burned judges and jurors, the authority of perjured executives, mobs, blasphemers, licentious, corrupt men and women, all hell knocking off a corner here and a corner there. And thus I will become a smooth and polished shaft in the quiver of the Almighty. Thank you. And that's kind of the whole point, right? If we resist, if we insist on staying our old selves, we'll be stuck. And we won't grow. And God wants us to be that polished gem. And what is this life if not us being placed in the tumbler, and then he turns it on, and then he goes away for a season, and he leaves us in there. That polishing will only happen if we look at the hard things of our own past, we look at our relationship to them, and then we ask that hard question of ourselves, rather than blaming somebody else or ascribing it to God. We say, what did we do to cause this? What can we learn from it? And how can I prevent it from going forward? We can't change what happened. We can't change what happens to us. We can change how we react. And then we sit in the pain and we sit in those tears. And because sometimes we really have to let it out. along the way. And that is the point. And the final thought that I'd share with you today, a special hat tip to some of our friends, that tears are good because what flows is alive. Crying is like a thunder shower for the soul. The air feels so wonderful after the rain. So don't think too much. Just breathe. Don't be harsh or demanding on yourself. Just experience your feelings and know that your tears are announcing change in your life. Change is coming, like a summer rain to wash away your pain. So have faith that things are getting better.
Excellent. That's beautiful. I really like that, Ben. Well, thank you very much. Thanks to everyone who shared. I do want to make sure that I thank the person who said that about Judy, who said that about Taylor. So thank you. I appreciate that sympathy. Thank you, Ben. What a great background and history for these sections, these lessons that we studied this week. I'm really appreciative of the time and thought that you put into that preparation. So thank you again, Ben. Thank you, John, for being here and arranging everything that everybody sees off to the side here. Next week will be September 19th, and the lesson for that week is Doctrine and Covenants sections 102 to 105, called After Much Tribulation Cometh the Blessing. So we will meet you back here again next Sunday, the same time, a little after 9 a.m. Mountain Time. So thanks again, Ben. Howdy to Brant out there somewhere. Thanks everyone for your support, your participation. Have a wonderful rest of your Sabbath and a great week, and we will talk to you again soon.